Now, this review from the DWRG. Normally I just read out the final portion of his rather long reviews, but this piece by Thomas Cookson is useful enough that I just want to read the whole thing. Cut and paste by Thomas Cookson, published on the 9th of the 3rd, 13 to the DWRG. What if Resurrection of the Daleks actually had closed Season 20? Resurrection of the Daleks dances between a plotless, incoherent mess of nauseating violent excesses and an interesting experiment in punk art visual storytelling, which Revelation of the Daleks later perfects. The opening massacre, whilst making no plot sense, is an admirably audacious, surrealist parody of police brutality. The Daleks' entrance is expertly handled, and Davros reveals a genuine surprise, but a lack of focus makes the Daleks feel surplus to requirements in their own story until their eventual mass destruction is overindulged, completely eroding their robust, formidable presence. For instance, Litton's men slaughter Styles and her crew in the self-destruct chamber, simply so the Daleks can reprimand Litton for his failure afterwards, leading to him making his escape plan. It begs the question, why not just send a single Dalek to exterminate them all, rather than waiting on Litton's elaborate, cumbersome break-in? That would make more sense and show the Daleks as more formidable. Alas, Saward's only interested in telling Litton's story. Ultimately, it's all rendered off balance by its nightmarish excesses and vulgar unpleasantness. What if Peter Grimwade had directed it as originally intended, weaving his Earthshock magic again, turning a potentially depressing, sadistic, leery production into something satisfyingly slick and dynamic, doing for the Daleks what Earthshock did for the Cybermen, given the same sharp eye behind the camera, with a story that felt focused and momentous rather than incoherent, punctuated by its violence rather than drowned in it? Would he have captured the energetic, euphoric spirit of survival horror instead of tired, mindless, suicidal self-destruction? As transmitted, there just seems no need for all its violence. But ideally, it should have felt wholly appropriate for a Dalek story with a brutal honesty about the horrors of war that goes completely against 80s army chic. Perhaps it would have worked if done with the same class that Earthshock was. Furthermore, would it have improved Season 20, making the season more than the sum of its parts? Arguably, Season 19, which is all about getting Tegan home, was the last time the show had a sense of direction, before aimless navel-gazing and apathy of the main characters took hold. Earthshock was perhaps the culmination of Season 19's "we're all in the same tribe" of ethos. So would Resurrection of the Daleks have given Season 20 a sense of culmination or direction, or at least some payoff? Maybe it would have been felt that after a season about the tedium of existence, we'd finally gotten a proper balls-out action story. The pantomime villains like the Master and Black Guardian were merely warming up for the Doctor's true greatest enemy, now deadlier than ever, giving the season a finality that the King's demons lacked, and even possibly redeeming the Doctor for his failure, letting the Master escape again by showing him annihilating a far greater threat to the cosmos. Resurrection of the Daleks could have justified the King's demons after all if, as is rumoured, it was Chameleon who was meant to fall under the Dalek influence and then overcome their control and self-destruct the station at the end, rather than Stian, which would have made far more sense. Maybe the King's demons would have ended with Frontios' cliffhanger, rather than the Doctor playing that lame, characteristically passive-aggressive trick on Tegan. Perhaps the moment where the Doctor can't bring himself to kill Davros would nicely bookend the Doctor's shooting of Omega in Arc of Infinity, as would the Dalek plot to assassinate the High Council. It also could have nicely echoed Turlough's choice and the theme of understanding life's worth and enlightenment. Indeed, the idea in Terminus of a plague sweeping the cosmos and an isolated, decaying, lonely outpost in space might have felt like just setting the scenery for Resurrection of the Daleks. The horrific fate of the soldiers in the warehouse might have also complemented Mordrin Undead's hint that the cosy, innocent days of Una were over and that the world was far less forgiving now. But more importantly, there's the issue of the Fifth Doctor's character. The problem with Davison's Doctor is that he was entirely defined by his contrast to Tom Baker. He was defined more by who he wasn't. He was specifically cast because of his professional behaviour, and because, unlike Tom, he would play the part as told to. The trouble is, few writers seem to know what he should be. J&T and Eric Saward had clashing ideas of who the Fifth Doctor was. To J&T, he was a dashing young hero with a tragic vulnerability. To Eric Saward, he was a moral nuisance who for too long had been validated by the packed trappings of a morally trite kids show. Other writers had other ideas, such as Bidmead's old man trapped in a young man's body. There was no solid writing team, and thus no consensus on the character. In fact, by most accounts, the writers were utterly neglected and treated as disposable props by J&T and Eric Saward. The result is that his character was rarely written strongly. He was sidelined and overshadowed by his companions. Hardly any writers, and certainly not Eric Saward, seemed capable of being on the same page as the Fifth Doctor, and ergo neither was the audience. This is pretty much unprecedented for the show, so even when Earthshock or Snake Dance seemed a defining story for his Doctor, afterwards a character reset button got pressed. At the same time as the Doctor was having his alien enigma and unpredictability eroded away, there was paradoxically a consistent failure to get to the heart of the character. It became buried in an impenetrable layer of earnest bluster, self-righteousness, and delusional, morally confused dogma, and despite his apparent nice guy image, he could sometimes be so high and mighty, condescending and judgmental that he was more like the Sixth Doctor than even the Sixth Doctor was. Only Christopher Bailey seemed to truly understand his character, being the only writer who liked the Williams era and was concerned that under J&T the show's protagonist had regressed. The Fifth Doctor was not the Doctor we knew. The Doctor we knew was somehow withdrawn and buried within him. His essence was trapped in a more broken, timid, juvenile and uncertain personality that had to serve as a vessel for him. It was the Fifth Doctor who was the regeneration gone wrong, not the Sixth Doctor. In fact, the transition from the Fourth Doctor to the Sixth and Seventh makes far more sense with the Fifth Doctor taken out of the equation entirely. Now, on the one hand, this is an aberration. It means we endured an entire era of Doctor Who where any semblance of the Doctor we'd all come to admire was utterly absent, in which we're waiting for the current Doctor to actually leave and be regenerated into the competent hero he's supposed to be. But potentially this idea, if done right, could really up the stakes and have emotional resonance. The idea of the Doctor's essence being trapped within a weaker body and having never been in a more vulnerable and fragile state, carried with meek delicacy by a humble courier who is simply trying to survive in a savage universe, is potentially thrilling. Might even be affirming and poignant for anyone in the audience who could relate to feeling that sense of uncertainty, foolish passiveness, or failure to measure up. But the focus and heart often wasn't there, and was instead on clueless attempts to homage old foes and old stories note for note, which only further limited his character growth, rendered him even more incapable of learning anything from his mistakes, made unfavourable comparisons with his far more competent predecessors impossible to ignore. Warriors of the Deep's problem is that it has a pathetic protagonist trying desperately to preach about our folly, and so had to be written with belligerent self-righteous insistence that the Doctor is right, that suicidal dogmatic pacifist lunacy is what the Doctor always has and always should stand for, and so should we. This would make even less sense if the story was transmitted after we'd seen him wiping out the Daleks here, but the overriding concern was to make stories neurotically faithful to a warped fan notion of the show's misremembered past. In fact, this became the only circumstance in which it was deemed essential for Eric Saward to do extensive script edits. Whilst many fans insist they saw and responded with a sensitive heart, Davison's Doctor, I doubt that the public did. The public quite liked Tom Baker and weren't as eager as fandom to have him replaced with someone so self-consciously, desperately different, but then the public weren't told what to think by DWM or told how to see Davison's Doctor in a sensitive light like we fans were. Season 20 is arguably where the Doctor as a character really begins to suffer. He'd been fallible and doubtful in Season 19, but usually for legitimate, overwhelming reasons. In Season 20, he'd become simply a bystander. Now Terminus and Mordrin Undead had demonstrated that this need not be a flaw if all the Doctor needs to do is let the hand of chance resolve all problems instead. The right kind of nothing. Thus he didn't really come off as anywhere near the liability he becomes in Season 21. Snake Dance is one of the few stories to acknowledge this idea of Davison's Doctor as the self-doubting, withdrawn vessel, a story very much concerned with the Doctor needing to find his buried centre in order to succeed. Again, though, anyone expecting this to provide a lasting breakthrough for the character in stories after would be sorely disappointed. But whilst Eric Saward never seemed to regard the Doctor much, Resurrection of the Daleks did utilise a similar idea to Snake Dance. The idea of the Doctor's true essence being buried is echoed by the scene where the Dalek conditioning is ripping through his memories. Again, this is visual, emotional storytelling. After this, the Doctor's heart-knelly and ruthless streak becomes reawoken. He promises to correct the mistake he made in Genesis of the Daleks and almost executes Stavros, but ultimately chickens out. On the one hand, that moment proves Stavros correct about the Doctor's weaknesses. It even retroactively ruins the Doctor's ambiguity and hint of darker streak in Genesis of the Daleks when he threatens to shut down Davros' life support and sounds like he's not bluffing. Here there's no doubt he was bluffing. However, the audience actually is on the same page as him in that moment, and it is perhaps one of the strongest examples of Eric Saward's writing, showing a postmodern understanding that morality is simply a state of mind and merely based on an individual's point of view, like the philosophical musings in Snake Dance. If both Snake Dance and Resurrection of the Daleks in the same season had portrayed the Fifth Doctor this way, would we have had a more definitive portrayal of him in future, rather than the morally confused, utterly alienating portrayal we got in Season 21? Could we forgive its moral torpor if it was simply a one-off in an otherwise lightweight season that briefly flirted with morbidity in Mordrin Undead and Terminus, but otherwise featured happy endings that didn't stay in the Doctor's hands? Here the Doctor's principles failed him, and his only choice was to break out the Marvellan Plague and wipe out the enemy, but would that be forgivable if it were emphasised by stories prior that this was a rare exception, rather than how Season 21 made it the rule? Maybe the Doctor's "do you think I wanted it this way" would ring far truer. For all that to happen, Resurrection of the Daleks would have to be not only Season 20's story, followed by a complete production team changeover.